the mic on. The Subcommittee on Innovation, Data, and Commerce will come to order. The Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Welcome to the first hearing for the Innovation, Data, and Commerce Subcommittee for the 118th Congress. I'd like to thank the chair of the full committee for selecting me to chair this important panel, and I'd also like to congratulate, again, Kathy McMorris-Rogers for being the first woman to serve as the chair of the powerful Committee on Energy and Commerce, the best committee in Congress. It really is. There's no question. Okay, I also want to identify our new members, our new Republican members of the subcommittee. Mr. Allen from the state of Georgia, Mr. Fulcher from Idaho, Ms. Harshberger from the state of Tennessee, and then, of course, Mr. Duncan, and I'm glad to see you're back on the subcommittee from the great state of South Carolina. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah. And then we also have, of course, the great friend of mine, Kat Kamen, from the great state of Florida, and she represents Gator Nation. Finally, I want to thank my esteemed colleague, Tim Wahlberg, from the great state of Michigan, for serving as vice chair of the committee. I'm greatly looking forward to working with Mr. Wahlberg, and I appreciate his partnership. We're going to do great things in this committee. So Ranking Member Schakowsky, who did an outstanding job as the chair in the previous Congress, I'm glad to see you're leading the subcommittee again. And for our friends across the aisle, we worked very hard together last Congress, moving forward. Very good success, great initiatives that went to the President's desk. This included legislative wins like the Inform Consumers Act, which will protect consumers from stolen and counterfeit goods online, including those coming from China, and my bill, the Ransomware Act, which requires the FTC to submit recommendations on how to make America more resilient from ransomware and cyber attacks, specifically from cross-border foreign threats like China and Russia. Switching gears, today's hearing focuses on the great threat to our country right now, China. So it is fitting that to begin the 118th Congress, we focus on this threat and discuss how to recapture and maintain our global leadership. The CCP will stop at nothing to undermine our global leadership and weaken our economy. They've bought up our farmlands, stolen our intellectual property, and embedded themselves deep within many of our supply chains. Now they're turning their attention towards establishing the global standards for emerging technologies. We're not going to let it happen. The CCP has invested heavily in artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. Paired with this investment, China is creating favorable environments for their private sector, companies, and entrepreneurs to deploy and test these technologies. This has forced many American companies with global footprint and American innovators with cutting-edge ideas to consider a hard decision, whether to move their operations from American to Chinese shores. It's also allowing Chinese companies to invest and expand further, potentially endangering our own infrastructure and data security. Waiting any further on a national framework is weakening our stance by the day, and time is of the essence. Can't emphasize that enough. Time is of the essence. It is imperative that this committee establishes foundational frameworks for developing emerging technologies. We came close last Congress when we passed the bipartisan, bicameral American Data Privacy and Protection Act. But this Congress, we need to ensure it gets across the finish line because China is not waiting on us to influence international norms and standards. And I want to commend the previous chairman, Mr. Pallone, and the previous ranking member, Ms. Rogers for getting it through committee, which was really incredible, historic. Now we got to get across the finish line as soon as possible. I look forward to working again with Chair Rogers, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and Pallone, and the members of this committee to finish what we started. We need to get this done, and it is a priority. It's a priority for the American people. We must ensure our nation remains a leader in global technology standards. The American people are the most innovative in the world. I know you know this. It is our job in Congress to ensure that we eliminate bureaucratic red tape that has too often hampered innovation in the marketplace. For something like autonomous vehicles that will help senior citizens and Americans living with disabilities, it means reducing barriers to testing and setting the standards for how they will be adopted across the world and provide certainty for businesses and consumers. America's global leadership depends on its people to be the best in class, and we must give them the regulatory certainty on, that's the key, on emerging technologies they need in order to live up to their legacy. If we fail, America will be left behind, and our competitors like China will leave us in the dust. Again, we're not going to let that happen. I'm eager to hear from our panel of experts today on such a critical topic. Thank you again to the witnesses for being here today, and I yield back. The chair recognizes Subcommittee Ranking Member Schakowsky for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Chairman Bilirakis. I am so excited to be back here on this in the subcommittee, working with you, working with our new members, and working with our returning members on both sides of the aisle. You know, we were so successful passing bipartisan legislation in the last Congress. There was hardly any difference between us. And so I really look forward to continuing to do this. And I did want to mention, you talked a bit about the challenge of competitiveness with China. And I want to congratulate you on maintaining our jurisdiction. There is a new special committee dealing with China, so thank you for making sure that this idea of our competitiveness and our ability to compete in a positive way with all of our competitors and certainly adversaries. So good work in making that happen. But I did also want to mention some of the things that we did. You mentioned a couple of these bills. But I want to say that we were able to pass out of the full committee the consumer protection and our legislation on the privacy legislation that we were able to get out of the House, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, and I'm hoping and looking forward to as a priority to try and move that. Americans want to do that. We passed the Consumer Protection and Recovery Act. We also passed out of into law Reese's Law, Protecting Children, the Informed Consumer Act, which is not only good for consumers but for businesses that have been losing money, the Sturdy Act, Protecting Children from furniture that falls over on them, the Ransomware Act, and the Restoring Brand USA. These were two of your bills, and I was happy to co-sponsor. The Manufacturing.gov Act, Safety Sleep for Babies, FTC, the FTC Collaboration, is that right? Act of 2022, the Carbon Monoxide Poisoning Prevention Act. I mean, so many things for consumers for ordinary people that we were able to pass into law. But I definitely do want to say that let's make a priority of passing our privacy bill. I think this will really put us on the right track. And let me also say, we know that there's a lot of work to be done to make our supply chain resilient, and we need to work on that. Also, we face these new challenges with the growth of artificial intelligence that we need to address. And let me just say in closing, now is the time for us to come together. We can do this, we have done this, and I really look forward to the advances that we're going to make for consumers, for business, and for the economy of our country. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. The chair recognizes the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, everyone, to the first hearing of the Innovation, Data, and Commerce Subcommittee of the 118th Congress. It's great to have everyone here, and I'd like to congratulate my good friend, Congressman Gus Bilirakis, on becoming the chairman of this subcommittee, as well as my friend Mr. Wahlberg for being the vice chair of the committee. This committee plays a vital role in advancing American competitiveness and global technological leadership, and it's critical that we use this panel to ensure that America, not China, is setting the rules of the road for technologies of tomorrow. It's no secret that the Chinese Communist Party wants to replace the United States as a global economic and technological power. Whether it's artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, or smart devices, China wants to dominate these new and emerging technologies. But China's vision of the future is not one that welcomes American values. Values like freedom of speech, privacy, entrepreneurial enterprise, individual rights, or the rule of law. The Chinese Communist Party, on the other hand, spies on its citizens and asserts strict government control over businesses and the economy. We need to make sure that these technologies of the future are developed in an ecosystem that promotes American values, not China's. And this is a race that we cannot afford to let them win. We must work together to cement America's global technological leadership. We should start by passing comprehensive privacy and data security protections with one national standard. We made history last year when we passed the bipartisan, bicameral American Data Privacy and Protection Act 53-2 out of this committee, full committee. But our work isn't over yet, and we've already fallen behind other countries in establishing a national privacy standard. I want to thank Mr. Pallone and Ms. Shirkowski, and of course Mr. Bilirakis for his leadership on this, and I'm eager to continue that work. It is a top priority for Americans, and it needs to be achieved this Congress. And we can't stop there. It's also important that we take action to ensure the development and the deployment of self-driving cars. The regulatory framework for self-driving cars must be led in the United States. And again, this comes down to our values versus the Chinese Communist Party. American values the importance of safety for our citizens. China does not. We value our workforce and free market economies. China does not. We value civil society groups and their right to speak freely. China does not. To win the future, the United States must lead on self-driving cars. We must chart a path so the road is one we design. And this can be the year we finally push past the barriers which have derailed the Self-Drive Act and other legislation from becoming law. And we can also build on the American Compete Act legislation, which I had sponsored in the 116th Congress and worked with then Chair Ms. Shirkowski to get passed. It was on promoting emerging technologies, which was enacted with many provisions led by members of this committee. The best way to beat China is to spur innovation and remove unnecessary, burdensome regulatory barriers. We cannot and we should not even try to beat China at their game of massive government handouts and centralized industrial policy. We won't outspend them, and authorizing billions of taxpayer dollars without removing burdensome red tape will only lead to waste. Instead, we need to encourage innovation, ingenuity, and entrepreneurship, that's the backbone of our economy. And that can only be achieved with a government that encourages low barriers to entry for innovative technologies and startups, and the adoption of emerging technologies that will improve people's lives. Ensuring federal agencies don't put undue burden on businesses and innovators will be a top priority for this Congress. Whether it's ensuring people's online information is secure, charting an achievable path towards the development and the deployment of self-driving cars in the United States, or setting the global standards for AI and other emerging technologies, this subcommittee is at the center of it. You know, the American ingenuity built its first car. America built its first car in 1893, and then we went on to dominate manufacturing the car for over 100 years. And we must secure and win the future in the auto and the tech sector. You know, I look forward to working with every member on this panel to preserve our global leadership, strengthen our economic and national security, and beat China. My door is always open. I want to thank the witnesses for all being here. Your testimony is critical and educating all of us, and I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for your testimony. Appreciate it. Now I'll recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and congratulations again on your being made the chairman of the subcommittee. America's economic competitiveness has helped cement America's technological, political, and national security dominance, but our nation's competitiveness is facing unprecedented challenges. For 3 decades, the Institute for Management Development designated our nation's economy as one of the 5 most competitive in the world. 3 years ago, during the Trump administration, that ranking plummeted to 10th. Globalization, protectionist policies, and extraordinary market interventions by our economic rivals are key reasons for this drop. The Chinese government, a frequent purveyor of predatory economic practices, has adopted policies to give Chinese companies an unfair competitive advantage. This includes massive tax breaks and subsidies for Chinese companies, stifling restrictions on access to the Chinese market, currency manipulation, foreign mergers and acquisitions, forced technology transfers, and intellectual property theft. Their goal is to dominate high-tech industries like 5G, supercomputers, artificial intelligence, and advanced manufacturing that are essential to economic prosperity and military superiority in the 21st century. And as a result, American manufacturers, innovators, and workers are operating at a competitive disadvantage. Chinese manufacturers' output rose by 170% between 2008 and 21. Over that same period, the U.S. production only grew by 12%. Chinese companies now dominate the market for vital telecommunications network equipment, smartphones, commercial drones, and photovoltaic cells for solar panel production. China is also the largest producer of lithium battery cells and is making strides in the production of electric vehicles. Now, fortunately, these unprecedented challenges to our economic prosperity and competitiveness are not going unchallenged. Last Congress, congressional Democrats delivered by taking bold action to strengthen our manufacturing base, help create good-paying jobs for American workers, unleash more innovation, and lower costs for consumers. The CHIPS and Science Act was one of the major laws that we passed last Congress, and it invests $52.7 billion to spur American semiconductor production. It will ensure more superconductors are produced right here in the United States, and our reliance on other countries like China, and lower costs for consumers for automobiles, consumer electronics, home appliances, and other goods. It also invests $1.5 billion to support the deployment of innovative American-made telecommunications equipment to help counter the spread of harmful network equipment like China-backed Huawei. The CHIPS and Science Act was a major win for our global competitiveness, for our economy, for our consumers. Based on the title of today's hearing, you would have thought congressional Republicans would have been running to the floor to vote yes on this bill, but only 2 Republicans on this committee supported it. The other 27 opposed it. While the overwhelming majority of Republicans opposed the CHIPS and Science Act, we have an opportunity to double down on these monumental victories and enact more vital competitiveness legislation into law this Congress. And I know that both Chairman Bilrakis and our ranking member Schakowsky mentioned the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which is the comprehensive privacy legislation that myself and Chairwoman Rogers sponsored last Congress. And this bill ensures that consumers, wherever they reside in this country, will have meaningful control over their personal information while providing clear and consistent rules of the road on privacy and data security to innovators, entrepreneurs, and small tech companies. And I'd also like to see us move the Supply Chain Resilience subtitle in the America Competes Act, which passed out of the House last Congress. This would create a new office within the Department of Commerce responsible for leading a government-wide effort to support manufacturing and strengthen supply chains critical to the nation's economic vitality and national security. We can continue to blaze a path to a more competitive, stronger economy by building on the work of the last Congress, but one thing we cannot do is dangerously play chicken with the debt limit, as House Republicans are threatening to do. House Republicans have pledged the nation's full faith and credit to force devastating cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and that's not the way to ensure our nation leads the pack economically. So I hope congressional Republicans realize the severe economic consequences of this action might have, and I also hope we can begin to work on bipartisan solutions to bolster our economy and to outcompete the world. And I urge a strategy that's bipartisan and that will return to responsible governance, working in the interests of all Americans. I think all of us have America and our constituents at heart, and we can work together as we have in the past to achieve bipartisan solutions to deal with this challenge from China and other competitors. So I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the ranking member. We have now concluded with members' opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be part of the record. We'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to travel to Washington, D.C. to testify before the subcommittee. Today's witnesses will have 5 minutes to provide oral testimony, which will be followed by a round of questions from members. Our witness panel for today's hearing will include Mr. Jeff Farah, the Executive Director of the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association. Welcome, sir. Mr. Mark Jarsulik, who is a Senior Fellow and Chief Economist at the Center for American Progress. Welcome. Ms. Sam Sachs, a Cyber Policy Fellow, International Security Program for New America. Welcome. Mr. Brandon Pugh, Policy Director and Resident Senior Fellow at R Street Institute. We appreciate you being here as well. So, Mr. Farah, we'll begin with you, and you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Chair Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Chairman Bilirakis, Ranking Member Schakowsky, distinguished members of the committee. It is my honor to be here before you today. I am privileged to lead the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association, which is the unified voice of the AV industry and represents leading automotive, technology, trucking, and transportation companies. Our mission is to advocate for the safe and timely deployment of autonomous technology that will increase safety, expand mobility, and boost supply chains. We appreciate the strong leadership that has come from this committee in past Congresses and look forward to working with you this year. It is important to recognize that autonomous vehicles are not science fiction. They are here today. Across the United States, autonomous driving technology is being applied to passenger vehicles, trucks, delivery vehicles, and shuttles. AVs are operating in Arizona, Arkansas, California, Florida, Michigan, Texas, Washington State, and more. It is key to understand why developers are focused on bringing AV technology to market. It is not an exaggeration to say that safety motivates everything that the AV industry does, and AVs will make Americans safer. After all, AVs don't speed, they don't drive drunk, and they don't drive distracted. Sadly, human drivers do all of those things. And the Department of Transportation has affirmed that human behavior is the overwhelming contributor to the 43,000 deaths on American roads that we suffered in 2021, which is an 11% increase over the year before. Our industry offers a solution to this tragic problem. Autonomous vehicles are safer than human drivers because they use advanced technology to develop a real-time, three-dimensional view that informs the automated driving system, which is the brain that drives the vehicle without the need for human input. AVs are capable of making quicker decisions with many more inputs than a human driver. Beyond improving safety, AVs have the potential to radically improve mobility for the elderly and disability communities. AVs are also starting to show how they can ease the supply chain crisis and deliver environmental benefits. Let's turn to the issue of AV adoption worldwide. American AV companies have the most advanced autonomous vehicles, and billions of dollars have been invested in innovative companies. But unfortunately, the United States is at severe risk of falling behind the rest of the world on AV public policy, which could deny Americans the technology's life-saving and mobility benefits. One competitor is the Chinese government, which has made AV development a top priority and highlighted AVs in its Made in China 2025 strategic initiative. These measures are producing autonomous companies with global aims. China's focus on advancement in this space should be alarming, as no American policymaker should want to see a world where China dominates the AV market. This scenario presents national security challenges and would also mean that the U.S. would not see much of the job creation from a prosperous AV industry. The United States cannot assume it will win the global AV race, thereby securing a leadership position in what many estimate will be a multi-trillion-dollar market opportunity. For the United States to win the AV race, we must put in place a national policy framework focused on deployment and commercialization. The time is long past due. As efforts to enact a national AV framework have stalled in recent years, 22 states have taken action to authorize deployment of autonomous vehicles on their roads. State-by-state action is not ideal, but it has become important for AV advancement in the absence of a federal framework. I detail what a federal policy framework should look like in my written testimony, which includes reforming the vehicle exemption process that is harming commercialization and completing agency rulemakings that remove barriers to deployment. This action would send a strong message that our country is determined to be the global leader on the next great technological change for our world. We are at a crossroads for the American AV industry, and frankly, we need your help. Make no mistake, the United States can lead the way on autonomous vehicles, but policymakers must prioritize AV policy and do so with urgency. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Farrar. Now we'll recognize Mr. Jarsulik. You're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Balakis and Ranking Member Schakowsky, for the opportunity to testify at this important hearing. Today I will focus briefly on 3 points: the importance of a strong manufacturing sector for economic competitiveness and national security, the requirements for success in advanced manufacturing, and the need for effective industrial policy to support that success. First, on manufacturing, the importance of manufacturing competitiveness. Manufacturing has historically been a source of productivity growth and high-wage employment. Much of manufacturing productivity growth has derived from innovation, that is, the adoption of new technologies. The ability of many U.S. manufacturers to operate at the technical frontier has made U.S. manufactured goods competitive internationally, and until recently, the U.S. was the largest manufacturing exporter. While in the aggregate, much of U.S. manufacturing productivity remains at the frontier, the competitive lead has been eroded. For example, in recent decades, German manufacturing total factor productivity growth, which is commonly used as a measure of innovation, has exceeded that of the U.S. U.S. manufacturing has also been challenged by the rise of China as a competitor. China has overtaken the U.S. as the world's leader in manufacturing value added, and leads the U.S. in manufacturing exports. In addition, the Chinese government is devoting considerable resources to move ahead in crucial areas such as artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, energy-saving vehicles, biopharma. These challenges to U.S. leadership in advanced manufacturing create both economic and security risks. The reduction in domestic auto production over the past 2 years, caused by semiconductor chip shortages, illustrates the economic risk posed by disruptions to semiconductor supply chains. Security risks are illustrated by the Department of Defense's ongoing reliance on Asian producers of micro-printed circuit boards, which are essential to many national defense electronic systems. Let me now talk briefly about the requirements for advanced manufacturing. Advanced manufacturing success has 4 basic elements: scientific discovery, the ability to translate new science into prototypes and new processes, standards and tests to control quality, and a well-trained workforce. Because private actors can't capture all the benefits of investing in these requirements, it's hard, for example, to keep scientific ideas secret or to prevent well-trained workers from going elsewhere. The level of investment in each of these can be insufficient. When there are public goods obstacles of this kind, policy can help to overcome them. In the 1990s, for example, Sematech, an industry-government consortium, helped to develop semiconductor manufacturing processes and novel measurement techniques. These collaborations help maintain industry competitiveness. Let me now say something about the need for effective industrial policy. With the major exceptions of support for basic scientific research and defense-related investments by DARPA and other agencies, domestic policy has not systematically focused on manufacturing in recent decades. Given the challenges facing U.S. industry, this neglect has not been benign. It's therefore encouraging that several pieces of legislation passed in the last Congress include important industrial policy measures. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act is a major step in restoring and upgrading basic public infrastructure. The CHIPS Act provides substantial new support for basic scientific research in strategic areas, public-private partnerships with industry, STEM education and workforce training, and standard setting by NIST. The Inflation Reduction Act provides important incentives for private investment in clean energy and climate-related production over the next decade. Taken together, these 3 bills provide support for public goods and create private sector incentives that will strengthen our manufacturing competitiveness and national security. In conclusion, it's reasonable to say that a competitive advanced manufacturing sector delivers important economic and security benefits. It's also reasonable to say that U.S. manufacturing is more likely to stay on the competitive frontier and to minimize economic and security risks if it's supported by effective industrial policy. These facts make industrial policy a crucial area for future action. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the witnesses for sticking to the 5 minutes, or under the 5 minutes. Good timing. Okay, now we'll recognize Ms. Sachs for her 5 minutes of testimony. Thank you.
Chairman Bilirakis, Ranking Member Schakowsky, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm a senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center and at New America. I'm also a senior fellow for China with the Cross-Border Data Forum, and I advise U.S. corporate clients on China's technology policies. I've been an analyst and a linguist focused on Chinese data and cybersecurity policies for over a decade. While my expertise focuses on China, my view is that the most effective solution for strengthening U.S. competitiveness and leadership in governing emerging technologies requires an approach that is more comprehensive than our response to any single country. Passing federal privacy law that addresses how all companies collect, transfer, and process data will enhance competition while also addressing harms regardless of where that risk originates. U.S. lawmakers have an opportunity here to both address transnational threats while also advancing a more secure, ethical, and democratic global internet in its own right. The Chinese leadership has embarked on an ambitious national data strategy with the goal of acquiring, collecting, and extracting value from large volumes of data. My written testimony provides more details on this issue. Beijing could use data collected and aggregated from overseas to build profiles of individuals with national security clearances or those with access to critical infrastructure, enabling manipulation, coercion, and blackmail. Now, for most Americans, this is probably not going to be a top concern. But I do think that the impact on economic competition and U.S. global leadership in emerging technologies may be far more reaching. Access to data collected abroad provides Chinese companies insights into population and consumer behavior, risk tolerance, and other preferences. This helps to strengthen the competitiveness of Chinese firms by enabling them to develop products and services that are better tailored to markets beyond China. And it enhances the ability of those firms to then compete with U.S. companies. I'm talking about markets beyond the United States or China, as both Beijing and Washington increasingly look to decouple from one another's markets. The most significant step that U.S. lawmakers can take to strengthen U.S. global competitiveness while also enhancing consumer privacy and addressing these pressing national security risks is to pass comprehensive federal privacy law. The goal is to address all harms related to data processing and to focus on securing the data itself rather than a country of origin or any single company. Inaction by the United States means ceding leadership to Europe and to China in setting these global norms and standards. In addition, the United States should work with like-minded governments to develop a common set of standards that would allow data to flow. I'd like to note the potential for the global cross-border privacy rules, a data transfer alliance that requires companies to certify to common standards for privacy protection while enabling cross-border transfers for those certified companies. What this does is it creates a coalition of allies that are sharing data with the United States. The ability of U.S. firms to maintain high rates of innovation depends on access to global markets, to international data sets, and to talent. If U.S. firms cannot send data out of countries in which they operate overseas, this directly impacts economic growth and innovation. And AI that is core to building applications that work across a variety of demographics. I urge U.S. lawmakers to address national security risks and protect Americans' privacy by putting forward an affirmative vision for U.S. data governance. ADPPA marks an important step in this regard that merits further attention and discussion. Inaction will only make the United States less secure, less prosperous, less powerful, while allowing more space around the world for the CCP to set the rules and norms for technologies that will shape the future. Thank you.
Appreciate it very much. Next is Mr. Pugh. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir. Thank you.
Chairman Bilirakis, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for considering my testimony and for the invitation to speak at the hearing. Let me begin by thanking the subcommittee and the members of the entire Energy and Commerce Committee for the time dedicated to developing comprehensive federal data privacy and security legislation last Congress. We focus on finding consensus on a comprehensive federal data privacy and security law in the United States. One key aspect of our ongoing work is the intersection of privacy and security, including how national security and data security should be key drivers in passing a federal law. Data privacy and security are vital to both consumers and industry. However, such a law is vital to national security. This often underappreciated aspect is the focus of my testimony. Given the topic of today's hearing, I will focus my analysis on China. In 2020, the China Task Force found that the Communist Chinese Party has a record of using official government resources and companies with CCP affiliations to compromise the data of people around the world, and that the United States and its allies need to join the effort to secure data from the CCP surveillance state and other malign entities. These concerns are especially prevalent in China itself, where advanced technology is used to track and monitor their citizens with few, if any, protections. I wish I could say that the concerns raised in 2020 are no longer valid. In fact, it's the opposite. They're worse. Data can reveal everything from your shopping habits to sensitive parts of your life like your health and location. This in the hands of an adversary or malicious actor can have devastating consequences, especially for vulnerable populations. As one recent example in the Russia-Ukraine war, data can even be amassed to target disinformation campaigns or direct even physical violence toward those in conflict. This is certainly not an isolated capability and something that the United States should worry about. It goes without saying that the United States' rivalry with China has taken on a digital nature. And China has been in a race with us in terms of technology for years, from artificial intelligence to military-specific technology. There are ways to help mitigate and reduce these concerns, even though China's collection and abuse of data will likely never end. A national data privacy and security law, much like the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, also known as ADPA, last Congress, is the most logical next step. I will explore three main benefits and how it could address the data collection crisis, but my written comments expand on them. First, acting on privacy legislation makes America more competitive. Countries around the world have acted. Even China has privacy laws. Unfortunately, those are more likely to be disingenuous attempts by the Chinese government to appear concerned about privacy and security than genuine efforts to promote privacy. This is especially true given the continued surveillance abuses in China and the lack of security for even Chinese citizens' data. Nevertheless, the United States still lacks a comprehensive privacy law and is becoming an outlier, especially as a country that leads in trade and is looked to as a norm setter. This has led to companies both American and global adopting other frameworks as the default. The lack of a privacy law also does not obligate most foreign companies to follow specific privacy or security rules while operating in the United States. Congress has the opportunity to change this by enacting a law and clearly conveying the United States' position. Second, many aspects of ADPA would help mitigate data privacy and security threats. For example, ADPA contained data minimization principles, which means data should only be collected to the extent it is necessary or proportionate to provide a product or service. In addition to the value this adds to Americans individually in terms of privacy, it helps reduce the amount of data collected and available in the first place. Other beneficial provisions include a requirement for privacy policies to alert individuals that their data is transferred to select countries like China, and establishing strong data security standards. Preemption is also a beneficial aspect because it creates one standard, which will allow for threats from adversaries and bad actors to be dealt with consistently. Third, data privacy and security legislation has broader impacts. TikTok has continued to raise concerns on a bipartisan basis. Several options exist to address TikTok. But regardless of the path chosen, it's only a partial solution. First, TikTok is just one application from one country. Not only are there risks from other adversarial countries, there are also other current and future applications that will pose risks. Second, many software and hardware products that pose risks, like connected devices. While a federal data privacy and security law might not be the full solution to those concerns, it would serve as a way to help reduce what information can be collected, who it is shared with, require security, and provide for enforcement should be violated. Failing to act on federal legislation would ignore the broader risks posed by data and leave threats from China and other malicious actors unmitigated. The United States may lag behind other countries by not having a federal data privacy and security law, but the 118th Congress has the opportunity to chart a path forward. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Moving along nicely. I want to thank you for your testimony. Appreciate all the witnesses. We'll now move to the question and answer portion of the hearing. I'll begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to start with Mr. Farah. Congrats again on your new role with Avia. I hope the broad coalition you've assembled demonstrates the imperative of breaking the deadlock on this life-saving technology. To me, the mobility benefits are very important. I was disappointed that last Congress my amendment was blocked from being considered, that it focused specifically on providing a path for AVs to serve those living with disabilities, such as the visually impaired. I also wanted to recognize John Pare. If you could raise your hand, sir, I appreciate that, who is with us today from the National Federation of the Blind. Thank you. Welcome, sir. He and NFB have been tremendous advocates for the living, those living with disabilities, as well as the great benefits that self-driving cars will have a mode of mobility for the community. So very important. I can tell you that we need them in my congressional district, that's for sure. I'd like to request unanimous consent to enter into the record the amendment and the letter from NFB in support of the amendment I've submitted. Without objection. Ordered, so ordered. Mr. Farah, can you elaborate on the ability for China to turn the dials up on testing these technologies in contrast with what we have faced here in the United States? It seems like the CCP can just flip a switch, tell a province they're going to clear it for full AV testing, and race past the U.S. while we delay and argue over small political differences in regulatory approach. if you could address that. And how can we instead show the world that America's approach is superior by unleashing American innovation, American innovators, such as those flourishing in my home state of Florida and across the United States, please?
Mr. Bilirakis, thank you very much. Mr. Bilirakis, thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for highlighting the role that John and the National Federation for the Blind play. I think that mobility for individuals that have physical disadvantages is a key aspect of what it is that our industry is trying to achieve. And I've been fortunate to work closely with John and his organization and hear him talk passionately about the level of independence that AVs would deliver to individuals within his organization. Relative to your question, sir, I think it's important to note here that we obviously have incredibly different systems from the People's Republic of China and the United States. And while I think it's important to look at China as an important example of a country that has aims to be a leader on autonomous vehicles, by no means do we need to replicate what it is that they are doing in their country. We obviously have been successful in being global innovation leaders for decades in the United States, and we have our own American brand of innovation. And so I think that you all shining a light on this problem is very important, but we also need to make sure we solve this in an American way. I think that one thing that I elaborate on in my written testimony is the need for a federal legislative framework. This is something where we're very eager to work with members of this committee to determine your priorities, but also to do things like address the exemption caps for novel vehicles, address issues with the FAST Act, address issues with the make and operative provision, also look at a lot of NHTSA rulemakings that are going on. And so these are things we're very eager to do, and thank you again for the leadership.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you. I want to get to Ms. Sachs. You've just heard my concern, of course, Ms. Sachs, about how China can decide the future of this technology, God forbid. Can you provide some more color and analysis for what happens when we fall behind on technology like this, and what it means to American jobs and supply chains? This seems to, we don't want it to happen again, what happened with Huawei. So if you could expand on your testimony, we'd appreciate it very much. And I guess you've got about 35 seconds.
America should lean into our own strengths in having open markets, free expression, and use those strengths to target investments, incentivize R&D in these areas, as well as the governance structures of those. And I'm happy to provide more color in written form because I recognize that we're close on time.
I now will go to Ms. Schakowsky for her 5 minutes of testimony. Excuse me, questions. But it could be testimony if you'd like. It's your 5 minutes.
So I am so happy to hear the broad discussions about data privacy. And it has certainly helped us in the past with American competitiveness globally. But for decades, while America did lead the world in technological innovation, we are now seeing that there are threats by our lack of a comprehensive privacy piece of legislation. So according to the first page of Ms. Sachs's written testimony, you had a passage about the importance of passing a comprehensive federal privacy legislation. And I would just like to, I think Mr. Pugh, you commented on that, but I would also ask Mr. Farah and Mr. I'm sorry, pronouncing your name. Okay, what do you feel about about privacy legislation and its importance in the conversation that we're having today? Mr. Farah?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that privacy is obviously incredibly important. Our industry does not have a position on the previous legislation, but insofar as this subcommittee is active in that regard, this Congress, we'd be eager to work with you and share our views.
As we move forward on autonomous vehicles, I think privacy is going to be a big issue. Yes, sir.
I would agree that a rational, comprehensive approach to privacy is important. Invasions of privacy have real significance for individuals and households in the U.S. I think that's one of the reasons why the FTC is currently considering rulemaking with respect to online privacy. And I think, as other testimony has made clear, and I think it's pretty well known, that differential access to data within our economy and compared, say, to the Chinese economy has competitive significance as well. So I think legislation that addresses issues of privacy thoroughly and comprehensively could be incredibly valuable.
You know, I think on this subcommittee, we're so proud that we were able to get almost unanimous support on both sides of the aisle to pass it out of committee, and now we just have to go the next step. Ms. Sachs, I wanted to ask you, and I think and I want to hear more from Mr. Pugh, but on the issue of minimization and why that is so important in your presentation.
Thank you. You know, I'm not a privacy law expert, so I will defer to others on how specifically to think about that issue. But what I will say is that it's important to keep in mind a balance between two important areas. One is that the data collected and retained and not secured properly will be vulnerable to all bad actors, whether you're talking about a sophisticated state actor, a data broker, or those that are transferring it openly on the commercial market. You know, Equifax's security flaws were well documented, even though you had a sophisticated hack from China. At the same time, we also have to keep in mind a balance, right? Because as I mentioned in my testimony, AI depends on access to quality and quantity of data, and U.S. firms need access to that in order to innovate in AI. So certain things like a flashlight app, does it need to collect location data? I would say probably not, and so there need to be guardrails around the purpose that that data is collected. In other areas, we need to make sure that we're not being overly restrictive because of the need for AI to use quality and quantity of data. So how do we strike that balance? I think that's an area that very much merits deeper discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Pugh, did you want to comment on that, on the minimization issue?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So data minimization is one of the key reasons why ADPPA or whatever future bill it may be is essential to national security. We're essentially limiting the data that's available in the first place. As we just heard, we don't want to make it too constrained that we don't have the data necessarily for technology, but making sure we only have the data that's necessary and proportionate, using the bill's language, is so critical, and it helps minimize what could potentially fall in the hands of the Chinese government.
Mr. Pugh, your testimony mentioned reports of baby cameras spying on children. And I wondered if you would comment on that. There right now is no federal law that would stop that, even China doing that. You know, I think those of us who are parents here and around the country would be very concerned about protecting that data. Did you want to comment on that?
I'd be happy to. I think that to your example, Congresswoman, that is a baby camera spying on babies is definitely a real possibility. We also see vacuum cleaners mapping out homes. I think those are real concerns that we need to address, and it really ties into the benefits of IoT or Internet of Things, but also some of the risks.
Thank you.
My time is up, but I thank you.
I appreciate it very much. Now I'll recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last year, Congress passed legislation to encourage the building of semiconductor chips in the United States. I believe Mr. Pallone referenced this legislation, and without a doubt, is critical that we are manufacturing semiconductor chips in the United States. I just wanted to let people know that I raised with Secretary Raimondo, legislators and manufacturers themselves, that we should be pairing permitting reform with any federal subsidies to semiconductor manufacturers. Unfortunately, that seemed to fall on deaf ears. They were really interested in the money. So now we have manufacturers that are coming to us looking for exemptions from NEPA because the federal dollars are triggering long and erroneous environmental reviews for them. Now, I wish that they would have been open to those concerns before the legislation passed. So now the largest manufacturers may receive exemptions from the president. I'm not so sure about the startups or others across this nation. And it just highlights the importance. And I wanted to add to the record an article on Intel's horrible quarter revealed an inventory glut and underused factories.
Without objection, so ordered.
So, I agree that the NEPA process needs serious reforms, and I hope that the semiconductor manufacturers, the administration, and members of this committee will work with us on bringing common sense reforms to NEPA so that we can get America back into the business of building things. The number one barrier to building anything in the United States is the permitting processes. It's the number one barrier to manufacturing, building, doing anything in the United States. So we're going to go to work on that too. Back to privacy and the importance of a national data security law. And as been referenced, we passed the bill out of committee last year, ADPPA. I believe this is foundational. This is foundational for our global leadership and securing personal information for every American, especially from foreign threats. So to Ms. Sachs, we know that China has stolen our data, and we know that they're not going to stop. So would you speak to ADPPA in protecting us from future threats while also promoting new technologies?
The goal that I think this bill achieves is that it both manages to address the transnational threat, a range of bad actors, but also protects consumers and secures that data here at home. I've traditionally, I think that it's not a good idea to look at domestic issues always through a China national security threat lens, and I think skeptics might raise that question. This is a position, however, that I have long advocated, which is if we want to both address bad foreign actors and better enhance privacy protections at home, this is the baseline that we need to do it. And in terms of fostering innovation, as I've mentioned, U.S. firms need access to global data flows. But how do we do that in a safe, secure, and ethical way? We establish high baselines around how the data is collected and transferred and retained. And that's the balance that I think U.S. federal privacy law needs to strike.
Thank you. I referenced the legislation, the American Compete Act that I had worked on in the 116th Congress, and it really was requiring the Department of Commerce to drill down on emerging technologies and give us some recommendations on how we make sure that we're leading on AI as well as others. We're still waiting on those recommendations, but would you just speak to what you believe we need to be doing to safeguard our data while finding a balance to lead on AI?
I think here we play offense and we play defense. From an offensive perspective, we probably should not think about any single country, but how do we invest and incentivize innovation at home with a focus on digital infrastructure, fiber optic networks? How do we create better space for U.S. firms to compete overseas? And cooperation with allies and partners. The EU-U.S. Tech and Trade Council is one area. Working with Japan is another. I think it's also important to take what has been referred to as a small yard, high fence approach. Let's be selective about what we're protecting. Not everything is a national security issue, and in fact with AI, sometimes there is a symbiotic relationship, then it's hard to prevent code from crossing borders. So let's be smart and use a risk-based approach.
Mr. Fair, I understand you worked for the National Venture Capital Association. I'd love to talk to you further and hear more about how you believe the regulatory framework is impacting our market leadership. So anyway, but I ran out of time. I'll yield back.
I thank the chair, and I'll recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to echo the sentiments of Ranking Member Schakowsky about the need to enact the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which of course is bipartisan with the Chairwoman Rogers and myself. But I am concerned about, as I said in my opening, what the Republican leadership is planning on with regard to the debt ceiling. They've threatened to leverage the debt limit to enact crippling budget cuts to bedrock American programs. Experts have warned that defaulting on our nation's debt obligations, a debt that was amassed during both Democratic and Republican Congresses, could wreak havoc on our financial markets, potentially causing the stock market to plummet and capital markets to freeze. So let me start with Mr. Jarsulik. How would defaulting on our national debt affect American competitiveness?
Do good.
Well, I think that it's pretty well recognized on the basis of the previous incidents in 2011, 2013, where we came close or hit a debt limit, that the economic consequences can be relatively severe. I think we could expect upward spikes in Treasury rates if the default process went on long enough. There would be a translation of those interest rate increases into mortgages, into consumer credit costs, because those interest rates are based off Treasury rates. I think we could expect equity market declines. I think we could expect hits to consumer confidence, all of which reduce demand, slow the economy, and at a moment when people have concerns about tipping into recession, that creates a big risk. In the slightly longer term, repeated run-ups to debt limits and potential of default has already had an effect on the way that the world views Treasury securities. S&P downgraded us from the highest possible rating for sovereign debt, and that downgrade has persisted. If we go through another instance where we actually hit the limit, I think that there's a possibility that in the long term, foreign investors in Treasury securities will reevaluate the risk, and they will demand more of a risk premium in order to lend to us. So I think that the aggregate demand effects, the long-term cost effects of a default are really quite significant.
Well, thank you. Let me ask Mr. Farrer. Your testimony states that we must have a strong capital market to, quote, continue to lead on AV development and deployment. Now, how would defaulting on our national debt and destabilizing the financial sector affect your members' ability to develop and deploy AVs?
Ranking Member Pallone, thank you very much for the question. As I write, the capital markets are incredibly important because we have both innovative startup companies that are trying to deploy autonomous technology. We also have larger companies with experience scaling in the transportation sector that are financing a lot of the research that I mentioned and testing that is going on. And so certainly this is something that's very important to the health of our industry so we can bring the promise of AVs to your constituents. That said, we do not have a position as an industry on the default that you mentioned.
But your testimony also provides several recommendations from DOT that they could adopt to support the deployment of AVs. Would the DOT be better positioned to carry out these recommendations if their budget is dramatically cut?
The Department of Transportation is a very important partner to us. Obviously, that's something that we very much value, the collaboration. We have recommendations that we have put forward to DOT in terms of doing things like updating the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, and that's an ongoing conversation. In terms of overall funding levels, that's something we obviously defer to Congress and your judgment as to what those funding levels might be.
All right, and Mr. Jarsulik, how would stringent budget cuts affect our nation's ability to compete?
Well, really large budget cuts probably will affect the ability of the federal government to provide things that are important for the normal functioning of the economy. The federal expenditure supports healthcare, supports infrastructure, supports scientific research and development. And if those things are compromised, the functioning of the economy is clearly negatively affected. In addition, large cuts in expenditures will create an immediate shock to aggregate demand, and that can have important employment and output effects as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the ranking member, and now I recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Bashan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to congratulate Mr. Jarsulik for sticking to his talking points on the debt ceiling. to help out Chairman Pallone on that narrative. But the reality is we've never defaulted, and it always gets raised. The other thing I want to point out is that the CHIPS Act was included in a larger bill. We all know this, right? That had many, many policies the Republicans just couldn't support. And, you know, it's disingenuous to say we didn't support the concepts. Look, I understand the politics, and this probably won't be the last time we hear that narrative as it goes along this year. That said, thanks Chairman Bilirakis for calling today's important hearing. Ensuring American businesses and innovators can keep our competitive edge against China is an extremely important issue. And we must facilitate U.S. leadership in new technologies and ideas. One industry in which the U.S. has been a leader but is in danger of being passed internationally, particularly by China, is that of autonomous vehicles. I strongly believe in the potential of this technology. Last Congress, I co-led legislation to study crash avoidance systems to help make AVs safer for all road users. And I led a letter asking NHTSA to update safety standards for AVs and continue advocating for a national regulatory framework for AVs. So, Ms. Sachs, a question for you. I foresee a world in which the federal government may eventually procure AVs for certain types of vehicle fleets, and want to be certain that if that happens, those vehicle fleets are protected from Chinese data collection and storage. Do you have any recommendations on how we could prevent technological vulnerabilities in such AVs, or in AVs in general?
I'll defer to my colleague who's an AV expert, but I can speak to the broader question of how we protect the broader tech stack. And I think this is an area that is bigger than China, right? There are best practices for assuring hardware security in products, regardless of whether you're talking about a counterfeit, whether you're talking about a component that's made in China. And the same goes for building cybersecurity at the software level, where the U.S. government does have standards around that. So again, I would encourage the committee to think about this in bigger than any single country. And we need to also invest and incentivize in ourselves and play to our own strengths. But I defer to my AV expert colleague for specific.
Yeah, I just want to agree with you real quickly, and then we'll go on to Mr. Farrow about not a single country strategy. We want America to be competitive against our competitors, some of which don't like us and many of which do. So, Mr. Farrow, you want to comment on the AV, the cybersecurity and hardware security in AVs?
I would like to, but first, sir, I'd like to thank you for your leadership on autonomous vehicles in previous Congresses and look forward to the conversation continuing. I think from our perspective, cybersecurity is very important. Obviously, our industry is very motivated to make sure that the vehicles are kept safe, that those riding in the vehicles are also kept safe. And so this is something where there are obviously cyber threats out there. We support a risk-based approach where we can take a comprehensive view and look at how it is that we can best protect American equities. This is something where obviously the AV industry would like to be at the table on that, but at the same time, we're not different in many respects. I think there are many in the automotive sector, the technology sector, that need to be at the table so we can kind of get a comprehensive approach.
Yeah, and I would say in the AV space, you know, it's not just foreign actors. You know, cybersecurity is critically important, because if you just have somebody stand on the side of the road and hacks into an AV and diverts it off the road, you know, that's a problem. So this is, you know, this is an issue that we'll have to address. Another possible area where I have some concern is the CCP improperly accessing America's data through the CCP's new blockchain-based service network, or BSN. BSN has been advertised as a one-stop shop blockchain foundation which others can easily build on top of. While the last few years have shown how prevalent scams and frauds are in NFTs and other blockchain applications, something our committee must work to address, we cannot allow the CCP or other actors or anyone else to corrupt America's infrastructure once again. So, Ms. Sachs, you've written a lot about protecting America's privacy information from the CCP. What dangers do you see in adopting a CCC-created foundation for blockchains? And can we secure America's information if we allow other actors' components into our tech stack? And we only have a few seconds, so.
I'd be happy to submit some more comments.
That'd be
on the
great.
record.
Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Now I recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Representative Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for your testimony today. Welcome to the new members, and I do want to say at the outset here at our first hearing, it is especially important for this subcommittee to get to work on comprehensive privacy protections sooner rather than later, and I hope this will include the long overdue protections for children and teens online. Their safety is at risk. They're being constantly surveilled and targeted with ads. It's weighing on them in addition to all of the fundamental security issues that put them at risk. But I want to talk a little bit about EVs, because we're also suffering the costly impacts of the climate crisis. Those costs are weighing on our neighbors back home, on farmers, on the federal budget as extreme events continue to escalate. But it also provides an important opportunity. The race for cleaner, cheaper energy provides opportunities for American workers and American businesses. The transportation sector is the largest source of greenhouse gas pollution in the United States. And I know Rep. Dingell will agree with me that electric cars and trucks offer an innovative solution. We want American companies and workers to win the race for the future, but we're behind right now. That's one of the reasons that we devoted so much attention to, in the Inflation Reduction Act, new incentives for American-built cars and trucks, electric vehicles, and the bipartisan infrastructure law. We dedicated about $7.5 billion for electric vehicle chargers. So, Mr. Farah, how do you see that investment going so far for the electric vehicle charging across America, and what are your hopes in that area?
Thank you very much for the question. I would just note that Florida has been a leader nationwide on AV deployment, and that's something I'd love to discuss in greater detail with you. Relevant to the Inflation Reduction Act, that is something that our organization was not involved in that legislation, does not have a position specifically on the bill. I will say, however, that if you look out at the landscape of autonomous vehicles, many of them are electric vehicles, and that's something that will hopefully lead to a generational shift towards electric vehicles. We think we can be of assistance in that regard.
Are you plugged into the charging infrastructure, the planning that's going on at DOT and at the state level?
We can give you an industry-wide view of that to what degree we are plugged into that, and that's something that I think we value sharing the perspective. But the final point I would just make is that even for those AVs that are not electric vehicles, you also have a number of environmental benefits in terms of smoother driving, less idling, the ability to operate at night, and things of that sort.
Well, we have some challenges because in 2018, Chinese production accounted for more than half of all lithium battery cell manufacturing capacity and nearly half of all global EV sales. While the United States, the EV sales are just really starting to take off. Congressional Democrats in the Biden administration have really focused on this, and the Inflation Reduction Act is going to provide that relief and those incentives to consumers and then to the manufacturers and to the workers. Mr. Jersulik, why is it important for the United States to lead the world when it comes to electric vehicles design, production, and deployment?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that because of the risk created by carbon emissions, the world is going to move away from internal combustion engines in autos, trucks, buses. And if our auto companies are going to remain competitive, they're going to have to produce EVs. There's a lot of employment and output associated with this. The auto industry comprises about 3% of GDP. And if the U.S. successfully transitions to the manufacture of EVs, that kind of employment and income doesn't vanish. I think it's also important to remember that new techniques are being developed in the production of EVs, and if you want to learn techniques in manufacturing, you have to engage in learning by doing. So the sooner we can make the transition to producing AVs at scale, the sooner our manufacturers can join in that process of learning by doing and push the frontier forward and improve their competitive condition.
We want to win the future. We want to build those EVs in America and supply them to the world, and at the same time, create millions of good-paying jobs all across the supply chain. So thank you. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and I certainly agree. We want to lead the world. I also want to make sure that it's clear that, as our chair indicated, Republicans on this committee are fully committed to passing a comprehensive federal privacy and data security standard. We're committed to that. Let me also state, before I recognize myself for my 5 minutes, that just to make it clear, and as respectfully as I can, Democrats are the only ones anywhere talking about cuts to Social Security or Medicare or defaulting on the debt. That's clear, what's been stated. Let me go to my 5 minutes of questioning, and thank you to the panel for being here. China is actively using U.S. customer data to better develop their artificial intelligence, whether through mining and scraping, purchasing data or third parties, or through apps like TikTok sharing information with the Chinese Communist Party. Mr. Pugh, at a time when Republicans and Democrats agree that AI is a national security and economic imperative, shouldn't we be more cognizant of the amount of data we are making available to our adversaries? And secondly, what steps can we take to prevent U.S. data from being accessed by the CCTV?
Well, thank you, Congressman. So data in itself is essential. We need it for our economy, and we need it for innovation. To your point, the issue is when it falls in the hands of adversary nations and malicious actors, which we see happening on a second-by-second basis with China, unfortunately. And that's something that I really implore this Congress to address. And I think the best way to do that is by acting on a comprehensive data privacy and security law today. Why it would benefit consumers and industry? The security nexus cannot be overstated. And what I mean by that is just one aspect. This contains data security provisions. It would require data to be safeguarded. And if bad actor chose not to follow that, then there could be enforcement as a result.
Okay, thank you. Michigan, my state, is the motor state. Representative Dingell and I would certainly agree strongly on that. It's the motor state, and I want it to stay that way and expand, in fact. But China continues to push forward on autonomous vehicle development and deployment. I think a roadblock to U.S. leadership in this space is consumer comfort. Consumer comfort with the whole issue. I myself have expressed concerns about how autonomous vehicles handle the safety of pedestrians, motorcycles, and I'm a motorcyclist. I'm very concerned that we do this right and more. Mr. Farah, I noticed you didn't use self-driving, and I thank you. I thank you, because there is a auto company, at least one, that has used that, sold cars on it, and they don't self-drive. Driver assisted, all of that, we're there, and it's working well in most cases. And I think we ought to hold off on using that term self-driving for a while until we get it right. How are your members approaching public education about the safety of autonomous vehicles so that the United States can continue to lead on this important technology?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I appreciate the question, and thank you for your previous leadership on the Self-Drive Act and the dialogue we've had around some of your safety concerns.
And I hated that title.
I should note at the outset, though, that we acknowledge that public consideration of autonomous vehicles is very important, and our industry is doing a considerable amount to get out and talk to the American public, because your constituents are going to increasingly be seeing these vehicles on the roads, whether they're delivering groceries, taking them to destinations, trucks driving on the highway. It's important that people understand why these are safer than the alternative. And so that's something that we take seriously. We have a number of initiatives that we can talk about in further detail. I think one issue that I want to address, though, that you got at here is a lot of the confusion around driver assist technology as compared to autonomous vehicles. That is something that is absolutely critical, that people who are in the vehicle understand what they need to be doing. If they are required to perform any aspect of the driving task, they are in a driver assist vehicle. Secretary Buttigieg said it very clearly. If you can buy it in a showroom today, it is not an autonomous vehicle. That's important. Our industry is very clear in the language that we use, and we appreciate your attention. And
it'll give much more comfort as we keep that clear, so thank you. Today we have smartphones, smart light bulbs, refrigerators, everything. Though these sensors are working to a great degree. We still have challenges. While the United States has been taking steps to remove Hawaii and secure our networks that are involved with many of these things, Tuya has slid under the radar. I have an article by Klon Kitchen and Hal Brands which outlines the dangers Tuya poses that I'd like unanimous consent to enter in the record. Hearing none, it'll be entered. Mr. Pugh, how can we secure our network if the smart devices we rely on are compromised by the design?
So, Congressman, you're right. This is a critical issue. We rely on IoT devices on a daily basis, and the number of devices by 2030 are supposed to be 29 plus billion. The issue is we don't have a baseline for our IoT devices. So that is a great starting point, is seeing, is there a baseline that these device manufacturers should be meeting? Secondly, making more of them in America. I have more faith in American companies that do privacy and security enhancing things than I do with a CCP-backed company.
Thank you. I yield back. I recognize now my good friend and colleague from Michigan, Representative Dingell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As my Democratic colleagues have pointed out today, I do believe that we made some steps in the last, Democrats made some progress in enacting serious and significant legislation to strengthen our competitive edge on the world stage. But we all know that there's so much work we need to do to solidify our long-term economic might and define our national competitive advantage with countries like China. I associate myself with many of the comments that have been already made, and I'm very grateful to hear so many people talk about autonomous vehicles and the need to do something, because we don't always hear that. Electric vehicles are also critical in all of this, and further mitigating risks from U.S. supply chains and bringing them back, and I have 5 minutes and could talk for 5 hours or more. But let me move to AVs quickly. Cutting-edge technologies like autonomous vehicles hold the promise of improving safety, expanding mobility, and strengthening our economy. The moment, and it's only at the moment, as you and I know, we hold a competitive edge in developing and deploying AVs. According to KPMG, the United States ranks higher in preparedness for AVs than Japan, Germany, and China. But here's the reality. We got to preserve and expand this advantage by ensuring that the United States, not countries like China, write the rules of the road for this new transformative technology. That's why I've spent years collaborating with my colleagues and the stakeholders to establish that national framework. I know that under the Republican leadership with my chair, we're going to get it done this year for this Congress. I guess I should be realistic. But here's our truth. Autonomous vehicles are here, and every day we do not have a federal framework in place for the safe deployment of AVs, we're risking falling behind the rest of the world. China gets what's at stake. If the United States is going to stay at the forefront of innovation in AV technology, keep those jobs here in this country, not cede leadership to any other country, we got to get motivated and act. So, Mr. Ferrer, how can lawmakers and regulators lay the foundation for the continued development and deployment of AV technology to ensure the future of this technology stays in the United States?
Representative Dingell, thank you very much, and I share your passion for AVs and specifically around the safety and mobility benefits that we've spoken about in the past. And so this is something that I think we're talking about, literally transforming how it is people and goods move around this world, and that's tremendous. And so we are very hopeful to work with this subcommittee, this Congress, hopefully this year, to pass AV legislation that would set up that framework. There's also, frankly, work that needs to be done at the agencies as well in terms of updating a system that is many decades old. In terms of legislation, there's a number of issues that I detail in my written testimony. A few of them that are worth flagging here is that we have a outdated process as it relates to the exemptions process for so-called novel vehicles, where this needs to be updated. This is something that the committee has addressed before on a bipartisan basis. We also need to make sure that certain rulemakings are ultimately executed on and finished. And so these are things where we're very committed to doing this and certainly appreciate the opportunity to work with you and your team.
So I have 1 minute and 30, and I want to get to supply chain, but could you very quickly tell the committee how the absence of the federal AV framework affected the development, is affecting every single day, the development and putting them on the road of autonomous vehicles?
Absolutely. I would make two quick points. I think the first one is that I mentioned before the exemptions process. There are U.S. companies that want to be manufacturing these vehicles. They want to be deploying these vehicles. But right now, they are limited under this exemptions for novel vehicles to 2,500 vehicles per year for a maximum of 2 years. That is the wrong message for the federal government to be sending to companies that want to be producing these companies and ultimately benefiting the United States. And so that is something that I think needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed very soon. And so that is something that we can address in legislation, and appreciate your help.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm down to 33 seconds, so I'm going to want to put some questions in the record, but I do want to focus on strengthening the U.S. supply chains. I think most people don't realize how vulnerable we left ourselves from both an economic and national security issue until the COVID-19 public health crisis hit, and we saw that the private sector alone cannot identify, monitor, and address supply chain vulnerabilities. You know, we're so dependent upon China for the electric vehicles that you're talking about. Most people do not understand. Lithium has gone up $1,500 in the last 6 months in a battery. EVs are, I mean, we got to develop our supply here. We've got to work on that. I'm a proud author of the Supply Chain Security and Resilience Act. I'm going to ask you, Mr. Jarsulik, for the record and some other questions. What are some best practices to help us improve our nation's supply chain resilience? I'm over. You're going to have to write the answers to this. There's just so many issues that all of you can answer. This is the future of our country. Thank you. I yield back the seconds I don't have.
I thank the gentlelady. This proves that, I don't know if somebody else has a... Yeah, that would work better. So thank you for yielding back. Now I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder if Michigan is the mitten state or the motor state. I'm confused on that, but.
It's both.
Okay. I want to applaud what is going on in South Carolina with BMW, Volvo, and Mercedes and what they're doing with the EVs along with other vehicle manufacturing. And I apologize for this sound, but I want to remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that we're $31 trillion in debt and we're spending money that's borrowed. I say that because what is the role of government in subsidizing or funding these type things? I point to government spending on cash for clunkers. It was a failed program at the initial, on the onset, Obamacare rollout, the problems that it had. I believe in innovation at the private sector level. I think myself that we have more machinery of government than is necessary. Too many parasites living on the labor of the industrious. Government big enough to supply everything you need is big enough to take everything you have. The course of history shows that as the government grows, liberty decreases. That was a founding father, Thomas Jefferson, that quoted that. Liberty is the liberty to innovate and invent and capitalize off the profits of that innovation. I'm fascinated with AVs. I think the appropriate initial step is what I see happening in the trucking industry. Point-to-point delivery, oftentimes at night, with commodities, distribution center to distribution center, maybe local carriers. I think that is a way we can prove that AV works, AV's safe, and I love to see the innovation within the trucking industry as the future of AVs before we entrust that to the populace to get in an AV that maybe is driverless. I know we're not using that term in the future, but I do see that as the way for the future, both in trucking and passenger vehicles. So I want to shift gears a little bit, and Ms. Sachs, while the U.S. banned Huawei from building 5G infrastructure, Chinese state-owned automotive companies like AutoX and Pony AI continue to operate pilot programs in the United States with limited oversight. What types of information these companies collect that could pose a national security risk if shared with foreign adversaries that could exploit such information?
So AV companies collect many different kinds of data, and Mr. Farah might be able to comment in more depth on what that is. I'm not familiar with these specific companies. I can say more broadly from understanding, how the industry works from a data security standpoint. I think that there's not only potentially information about the infrastructure, the mapping, but I would also sort of push back and say, are they collecting information about mapping and streets that's any different from what you might find on Google Maps or that's available openly? So they're different kinds of data, and so one question might be, what kinds of data are they collecting, and who has access to it? And I would ask that not just for these particular companies of Chinese ownership, but any AV company more broadly, and what are the data security practices? The point that I've made in this hearing repeatedly is that we should focus on certain kinds of data have different levels of sensitivity, who has access to it, how is that being secured, rather than necessarily looking at a sort of country of origin or nationality when that data might be openly available on the commercial market in other forms.
Yeah, I think that's strong. I'm not concerned about this. I'm just stating this for the record. Uber already has, if I use an Uber to go to Walmart, they know how many times I went to Walmart or that I ate fast food. And who collects that information, how it's shared with others about my traveling habits, my shopping habits, my eating habits, and I think that's a concern of many Americans, what AVs will collect as you travel around. Mr. Farah, as a follow-up to that question, it's become abundantly clear that Chinese-owned companies are testing in the U.S. and sending information they collect back home. However, if the American company were to test their AVs in China, they would not be able to send that information back home. Is that correct?
Congressman, thank you very much for the question. First want to note, thank you for the appreciation for AV trucking, which is a very exciting trend line in our industry. I think that market access overseas is a big concern, generally speaking, for our industry. We want to make sure that as these companies scale and grow, that they have access to those markets. And so my understanding is that's a huge consideration in a place like China, where we don't have that same level of reciprocity, and would certainly be happy to dialogue with you and your team further about that.
Absolutely. There's going to be a lot of hearings on this type stuff, and I look forward to that conversation. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Now the chair recognizes Representative Blunt Rochester for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations as well. And thank you also to Representative Kelly and to the witnesses. I agree with my Republican colleagues that U.S. economic competition is the issue of the moment. Businesses and working people up and down my state of Delaware report severe supply chain issues that hamper their businesses and livelihoods. U.S. manufacturing has declined in recent decades, and with it, so has the resilience of critical supply chains. My colleagues across the aisle are right. U.S. leadership over standards and regulation are important. But U.S. leadership is just a means, not an end in itself. Ultimately, American families are counting on us to improve their economic opportunities. Talk alone will not create good-paying jobs that American families need. This moment demands all of us come together in a comprehensive, credible, and resourced strategy. This week, my colleagues and I will meet the moment by introducing comprehensive legislation to build resilient supply chains that ensure we can compete with China, Russia, or any adversary that intends to undermine our economic and national security. I hope my Republican and Democratic colleagues will join me on these bills. These measures invest in the central pillar of the U.S. competitiveness by investing in critical supply chains. They are also endorsed by over 150 businesses and trade associations, including the Information Technology Industry Council, Consumer Brands Association, National Association of Manufacturers, and the Motor Equipment Manufacturers Association. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert a letter and its appendix into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
This is a transformational policy. And as we saw with ADPPA and with the CHIPS and Science Act, this committee knows transformational policy is necessary to solve the issues hindering economic growth. Mr. Jarsulik, to reverse the declines in U.S. manufacturing, should we take a whole of government and whole of economy approach and incentivize reshoring of manufacturing? And does that include investments in production practices and workforce programs.
As I indicated in my testimony, competitiveness in manufacturing really is a source of productivity growth, and productivity growth is necessary for growth in wages and profits. I mean, you really need that. And therefore, what we can do through policy to strengthen manufacturing and strengthen its competitiveness has real economic importance. I think that the elements that are in the 3 acts I talked about, which are designed to overcome obstacles to private investment and to productivity growth in important areas ranging from semiconductors to biopharma, are going to make an enormous contribution. But I think there's much more that can be done. People who look at advanced manufacturing recognize that in addition to large corporations who are making investments, those corporations need to have the support of clusters of small and medium-sized enterprises who provide inputs and services to those corporations. And so work that can be done to bring those SMEs to the technical frontier and allow them to participate in advanced manufacturing is really important. There's a lot of that's embedded, especially in the CHIPS Act. More can be done.
You mentioned the CHIPS Act, and you also mentioned the semiconductors, and I think that's an example of us failing to evolve fast enough. Can you share with us any examples of industries or products that are at risk of falling behind unless we make these significant investments?
Well, we've talked a lot about EVs here, and I think it's very clear that some of the inputs necessary for the expansion of that industry really need to be looked at carefully. For example, batteries depend on certain kinds of critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel. And the supplies of those materials are not necessarily available in ways that will be secure or economically viable for us. For example, I think, oh, sorry.
Sorry, my time has expired, but I will follow up with you because I want to follow up on the issue of not just the raw materials, but also there is a report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies that speaks also to our national security risk as well, which I would also like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Very good.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. All right, we have my good friend from the great state of Florida, Mr. Dunn, please, Dr. Dunn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It is a great state, too, by the way. As we're all aware, in December, the Chinese Communist Party issued its 14th five-year plan outlining China's ambitions to become the global leader in the digital economy by 2025. In order to protect our private data and independence from the Chinese Communist Party, we have to focus on nearshoring and friendshoring our supply chains in conjunction with fair trade deals. We have to expose the CCP's pattern of commercial aggression against America and our allies. You know, examples abounded during the pandemic, massive impact on supply chains. But for example, in the medical world, we import billions of dollars worth of drugs and APIs from China annually, and this dependence on China is a national security concern. I look forward to working with this committee and my colleagues on the China Select Committee to enact policies that will bring critical supply chains back to the U.S. and to trusted allies to help free us all from dependence on China for critical commodities and pharmaceuticals. Mr. Pugh, first question. I agree with your statements that data privacy and security are vital to consumers and industry. Understanding that the CCP has repeatedly compromised our data and that the ADPPA from the last Congress was a good first step in combating this data gathering. Can you please speak to the seriousness of delaying that legislation?
Well, thank you, Congressman. That's a phenomenal point. And every day we wait, or every second we wait, I should say, is just the more data that the Chinese government, the CCP, is collecting and potentially exploiting against Americans. I mean, we see their collection happening in the United States, outside the United States, but still directed at Americans, and then we can't diminish the fact that they continue to just steal and even sometimes buy it. And that can unfortunately be used to target both intelligence professionals, those in the military, children. So I think it's just paramount that this is a key priority and is done without delay.
Are there specific pro-growth policies you would like to see from America?
I think one of the best policies would be first acting on the comprehensive data privacy and security law. And I think one of the benefits of ADPPA was the intent of trying to get at the fact that not all companies are the same, is that we need to take into account that small and medium-sized businesses have different needs and different capabilities than our largest international players. Not to say they all may not have privacy risks, but a mom-and-pop business on Main Street cannot comply in the same way or nor have the same risks. So I do think that is something that we should act on now, a comprehensive law, and vary some of the provisions.
Thank you for your reasonable approach to that. Ms. Sachs, you commented on the importance of multi-country approach for creating a network of trusted trading partners in which we lower barriers to trade in order to create resilient, reliable, allied supply chain. This makes so much sense. Can you expand on that issue? And perhaps say which allies, which partners we should be working on first.
Well, perhaps I'll highlight a number of initiatives that are underway which are really positive steps in this direction. So I mentioned global CBPRs, which is an expansion of the Asia-Pacific-based framework. In addition, the OECD recently issued a set of principles around government access to data, which would facilitate more data flows among OECD members. And the Japanese government under former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had put forward the data free flows with trust concept, which again is this idea to encourage a coalition of allies and partners to share data, but with certain safeguards in place. What does that look like, and what does that mean in practice is a question that I think experts are actively debating. And this spring at the Hiroshima Summit, my understanding is there may be further movement there. So these are all important initiatives, definitely merit further attention.
Well, I thank you for your words, and I would tell you I sit on the Economics Committee of NATO as well as these other things, and it's a common theme among our NATO allies that to friendshore trade. And so I hope we can find a way to work our way through these trade barriers that we've erected to each other. And this is like friendly fire when we were in NATO. So thank you very much for the entire panel. Very erudite group.
I appreciate it very much, Doctor. Okay, now we'll recognize Representative Kelly for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. During a time of crisis, the United States relies on its manufacturing base to withstand economic disruptions and respond to national emergencies. But the COVID-19 public health crisis exposed, as you know, serious gaps in our critical manufacturing supply chains that harmed our efforts to combat COVID-19, crippling shortages of N95 masks, gowns, surgical apparel, gloves, and testing supplies. The shortages were so severe that nurses substituted trash bags for gowns, doctors wore modified snorkels as masks, and essential medical personnel reused single-use N95 masks for days on end. These crippling shortages contributed to the spread of the disease, causing preventable illnesses, hospitalizations, and death. Our healthcare system near overload. Our healthcare heroes were placed under enormous strain, and the U.S. domestic manufacturing base was incapable of meeting the surging demand for critical healthcare equipment. Instead, hospitals and consumers turned to overseas fly-by-night brokers and opportunists selling standard PPE. Last Congress, when the Democrats were in the majority, we made meaningful strides to strengthen our global economic landscape to ensure our competitors like China don't leave us competitively disadvantaged. Just one example is the America Competes Act, which would have invested $46 billion for a whole-of-government approach to monitoring and supporting critical manufacturing supply chains instrumental to our economic welfare and national security. Unfortunately, that provision did not become law last term, but I'm hopeful that we can get meaningful supply chain legislation over the finish line this Congress. Mr. Jarzelik, in your written testimony, you discuss the importance of supply chain resilience and specifically how important elements of the supply chain are subject to events in other countries and can therefore be subject to Chinese government interference. How severe is the threat, and why hasn't the private sector been able to proactively identify and address such supply chain vulnerabilities?
Well, I think we've seen multiple instances where significant gaps in the supply chain manifest themselves to produce significant economic impacts. Salient example, which I talk about, is the shortage of chips for manufacturing autos. The production of autos in physical terms was down like 40% relative to the pre-crisis level, just because the chips that are needed to make those autos run weren't available. There are lots of other examples where shortages were revealed in the crisis. The active ingredients for pharmaceuticals, for example, are not here. They're manufactured elsewhere, and the ability to access them was stressed during that period. I think that it's quite important to take a systematic view of the places where there are potential risks, the incentives for individual corporations to meet risks beyond their own business needs are not necessarily there, and where those systematic risks are identified, steps can be taken to anticipate potential problems. There's simple kinds of things that can be done, stockpiling of materials that are needed, but there are analogies to other areas where there are risks that might apply here. For example, in power generation, many power authorities commission the construction of residual generation capacity, which corporations agree to bring online if there's a surge in demand for power. So we might think about the production of things that we really need and might need in an emergency and find ways to build that kind of backup or residual production capacity to prevent risks from becoming significant problems.
And let me ask you this. Last Congress, I was proud to co-lead the Bipartisan Supply Chain Act, which would create an Office of Supply Chain Resiliency and Crisis Response within the Department of Commerce to monitor supply chains of critical goods and materials and plan for, as you're saying, respond to supply chain disruptions. Could supply chain resilience improve if the federal government played more of an active role in monitoring critical supply chains and identifying vulnerabilities?
I think studying and monitoring of these issues can make a very important contribution. You don't know where the problems are until you identify them.
Sure. And I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Now I'll recognize the gentlelady from Arizona, my good friend, Ms. Lexco, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm excited to once again return to the subcommittee. It has such broad jurisdiction, and it's great. I'm very excited about the future of autonomous vehicles. I have a huge senior citizen population in my district, and I'm already a senior citizen. I can still drive, but there is going to be a point where I won't be able to drive. And a lot of my constituents are having problems getting to their doctors, getting to the grocery stores, and there's not enough public transportation available for them. They use the dial-a-ride, but they have to wait like a long time, and they complain about it, right? So I think this is a solution, and it's a solution for the blind, it's a solution for disabled, and I'm excited about it, quite frankly. Now, I think you know that in Arizona, under our former Republican governor, Doug Ducey, he was very excited about autonomous vehicles as well. And so we have several companies that operate in Arizona. One of them is Waymo, owned by Google. It is partnered with the Chinese automaker Geely. Waymo currently has a fleet of autonomous rides in Phoenix. So I have a question for you, Mr. Pugh. Should I worry should we worry about the partnership with a Chinese automobile company with autonomous vehicles as far as will our data be secure or will the Chinese Communist Party use it?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. I'm not as familiar with the partnership that you referenced, but what I can say at a high level is that when the Chinese government does have involvement with a company, it's something we need to be very careful and mindful of and ensure that they're not collecting data and then ensure it's not going back to the CCP. And then we also need to ensure what we are collecting is safeguarded and secured. I think those two go hand in hand, and you can't have one privacy without security and vice versa. So in that particular example, I think we need to make sure that the privacy and security is accounted for.
Thank you. And Mr. Farah, how would you anticipate the global AV supply chain to be set up if the U.S. continues to limit the ability of the U.S. AV industry to develop here while China has the backing of an eager government? So, you know, I remember California a number of years ago. They wanted to shut down the AV autonomous vehicle testing, and we picked up the slack in Arizona. So how is that going to affect it if we don't change our policy here in the United States?
First of all, I want to thank you for your enthusiasm for autonomous vehicles. We obviously share it, and your home state has been tremendous in terms of a partnership. I think you detailed one of our great member companies, and there are others as well. I think that the next point I would make here is that with regard to supply chain, autonomy has an amazing contributing factor here as it relates to supply chain challenges. I'll just give you one example, which is around autonomous trucking. We have a situation now in this country where we have a truck driver shortage of nearly 80,000 truck drivers across the country. That's going to double by 2031. And so autonomous trucking really offers a solution, and I think it gets to trying to alleviate the supply chain crisis that a number of your colleagues have flagged today. And so that's something where I've been privileged to ride in these autonomous trucks. I see the way in which they're operating. They are viewing things. They are responding to incidents on the road that a human could never have a hope of being able to see. And so I think it's going to lead to more safety for people on the roads, for truck drivers, but better movement of goods.
Well, I think so too, because, you know, as you said, is it like right now, isn't the first vehicle have a driver in it, and then there's like a caravan of other trucks that are autonomous and hooked up to it? Tell me more about that.
Not so much a caravan, but there are, so different developers obviously are approaching this in different ways, and there are situations where in places like your home state of Arizona, there are autonomous vehicles that are operating without a human driver sitting in the seat that can grab control of the wheel. There are other trucking examples where there's development that's going on, and there is currently a driver that is there in case. I've ridden in these autonomous trucks myself, and they're entirely safe, and they're operating now. And so it's really a diversity of approaches, but we are very eager and pouring a lot of resources into trying to get these out on the market in greater numbers.
Well, great. And I'm running out of time, but I was just curious if when you're answering somebody else's questions, if you can tell me, any of you, if you realize that security cameras that are made in China call back, if you're hooked up to the internet, they call back to China. And so a lot of the security cameras we use on our homes are made in China. Just curious about that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Yeah, let's take that question for the record, please. That's so very important. Thanks for bringing it up. All right, next we have my good friend from the state of Florida. We have a lot of Floridians. That's a good thing. That's a good thing on both sides of the aisle. So, Representative Soto, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Florida is in the house.
That's right.
First, I'm happy to talk about our economic future as the United States as it goes vis-a-vis our economic rivals, China. I want to take a moment to set the table for my constituents. The U.S. GDP, our overall economy right now, is first in the world at $25 trillion. But definitely China is on our tail, right? Chinese GDP is $18.32 trillion according to the IMF. When you look at our populations, we're at a scrappy 334 million according to the census, while China's National Bureau of Statistics has them at 1.4 billion. So imagine, we are pound for pound the economic powerhouse of the world. And if you feel like as Americans you're working hard, well, it shows. We are the most productive nation in the world per capita by far. Population growth is another interesting thing. Ours is slowing down. We had a 0.4% increase in population growth in 2022. The vast majority is from immigration, actually, not even from natural population birth. So as we're talking about immigration reform and the importance of immigration, we would be declining in population if we didn't actually have immigration. The Chinese, they are declining in population, 850,000 population drop in 2022. So both of us face challenges, and we're at a crossroads. So when we come to the topic today of how Americans compete to win the future, the good news is the 117th Congress was the most productive in 50 years. The infrastructure law to help us rebuild America. There's a big headline in Florida about Governor DeSantis proposing a $7 billion Moving Florida Forward plan. Over $3 billion of that plan comes from the new infrastructure law, and over $16.7 billion over 5 years to help redo I-4 and boost Sunrail and Brightline and Point Santa Parkway and other areas in the district. And then we passed the Chips and Science Act, boosting microchip manufacturing. We're right now only making 10% of the chips globally. This will help bring us forward with areas like Neo City in my district that makes aerospace, microchips, and micropackaging, and just received a $51 million Build Back Better grant with more to come. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, $369 billion investment to advance clean energy, to lower pollution, combat climate change, boosting electric vehicles, which we've talked about a lot, solar, wind, more efficient appliances, nuclear, and carbon capture. So the first thing I think is critical is that we don't push America to default on our debts. That's been talked about quite a bit already. The second is we need to find areas of common ground, like the privacy, internet privacy bill that we passed out last year that I expect will be one of the biggest things we do this term. But also implementation of these laws are going to be key. Mr. Jarsulik, you know, China faces air pollution, water pollution, plastics. Their soil is toxic with cadmium and other heavy metals. And the rallying cry of the last generation has gone viral by young Chinese people vowing not to have children. We want to have a different future here in the United States. So how critical is it to our economic success that we implement the Inflation Reduction Act to combat pollution, to boost clean energy for our economic future vis-a-vis competition with China?
Well, I think that the effects of a degraded environment on health, labor force participation, productivity are significant. And so to the extent that we can limit that, that contributes to the competitiveness of the U.S. And it's also the case that the world is being pushed in the direction of production and economic behavior that limits carbon emissions. And so the more that we can do to make that transition efficiently, the more economic competitiveness we will have. And so the kind of support that IRA gives to electric vehicles, to solar power, and to other forms of, and to the establishment of other forms of clean energy is incredibly important. The support that CHIPS gives to developments both in basic science and the manufacture of semiconductors means that we'll have a better technical base to implement the kinds of things that will reduce those carbon emissions. So I think that there's a lot that's being done that will contribute significantly to our long-term economic competitiveness and make up for the kind of disadvantages that we might face in the marketplace when we're dealing with a competitor who kind of disregards.
Oh, thank you. I think the gentleman's
Thank
time
you.
has expired. Appreciate it. Now we welcome the gentleman from Georgia. Welcome to the committee, and the chair recognizes you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for being here with us today, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and it's a privilege to serve on this committee under your leadership.
Best committee in Congress.
Yes.
Don't forget that.
Well, it's been very interesting here today, I'll tell you this. Mr. Pugh, first, I want to thank you for your service, for your work with the Army Cyber Institute. The Army Cyber Command Center is located in the 12th District of Georgia, my district. And it's good to see how expertise can be shared across the public and private sectors for data security purposes. We're not engaged in cybersecurity warfare here, but how do you see passing a national data privacy framework providing for more cooperation among allied countries against current and political adversaries? How do you see that framework?
Well, thank you, Congressman, and thrilled to see the Army represented in Georgia. I've spent a lot of time at Fort Benning, so appreciate that. And to your point, I think the biggest issue now, Congressman, is we don't have a privacy law here, so it's forcing American companies to follow other frameworks around the really, like GDPR in the European Union, that's just not as friendly to businesses. So I think this is really a key opportunity for us to develop a framework, and hopefully others follow what we view as the American vision. And I think the critical aspect of it is there are several provisions that promote security. Just to flag one of them is the notice if a consumer's data goes to China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia. Right now, data can flow there, and the average consumer is totally unaware of it, and that's just a deep concern.
Well, obviously, that's our property, and we have the right to protect it, and we certainly need to do something about this. Ms. Sachs, you've done a lot of work with security-focused think tanks. Again, you know, of course, we passed the CHIPS Act, which, you know, I think totaled over $252 billion. And now it looks like we've got a glutton of chips or semiconductors in the country. What is your think tank looked at, you know, what happens when the government pours money into something and then you know, it creates market problems, market issues as far as supply and demand?
Well, I can speak from a personal capacity rather than my organization's. I
Okay.
have not looked at that specific issue. I mean, I think you raise an important question, which is when governments pick winners and losers, we have to be very smart about how those resources are allocated. And particularly because we don't want to mirror China as a nation focused on industrial policy. So how do we use state funding and facilitate productive partnerships between the private sector and public institutions to understand how do we allocate those resources to avoid exactly those issues that you've discussed?
And we don't seem to look down the road at the implications of this as far as the free market. And Mr. Farah, the first thing is, how much do these vehicles cost? I mean, what's the price range?
Congressman, currently as so-called level 4 autonomy is being deployed out into the United States, they are not currently available for private ownership, and so you have companies that are operating their own fleets of AVs. They're doing things such as robo-taxis and with the passenger cars, unmanned delivery pods that are delivering groceries and whatnot, AV trucks that I mentioned. And so while private ownership may be in the future, that's not where we are currently.
So we haven't gotten a market base on the price of manufacturing those vehicles? Okay.
That is correct.
You're an innovator. Obviously, this is going to be a great tool for the American people. What's the best driver of innovation in this country? Is it free market or government?
Sir, what I can speak to is that our industry has led in terms of private capital investment into this industry. Certainly, this has been a private sector-driven exercise in terms of deployment of AVs to this point. But it is important that policymakers shine a light on this industry because there's obviously a lot of work that needs to get done, both from a federal legislative perspective as well as at a regulatory perspective.
Right.
And so it truly is a partnership, and we need your help.
Well, Ms. Sack, I think you hit the nail on the head where how does the government do this? Because they're picking winners and losers, and it affects all the markets. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I appreciate that very much. Okay, now I'll recognize the representative, Ms. Trahan, for 5 minutes. Appreciate, thanks for your patience.
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's no secret to anyone here today the United States has been losing the manufacturing race for a long time. It's certainly not a surprise to anyone in my district, which is where our nation's industrial revolution was born and where once great mills have sat empty for years. The offshoring of manufacturing jobs has hurt almost every sector, particularly as supply chain issues erupted during the COVID-19 pandemic. But perhaps the most glaring example of this dangerous trend is our semiconductor industry. Since 1990, the U.S. share of global semiconductor manufacturing dropped from 37% to 12%. And in that time, countries like China have surpassed us in semiconductor manufacturing capacity. Mr. Chairman, this trend poses a serious threat not just to our nation's economic competitiveness, but to our national security. And supply chain disruptions have shown in excruciating detail as we've waited on foreign shipments of semiconductors that have been bogged down in supply chain disruptions. Like many of my colleagues on this committee, I've heard how this issue is impacting businesses and families that I represent. Massachusetts companies up and down the supply chain, from manufacturers of cancer screening technology to defibrillators, have been sounding the alarm about the disruption's impact on their business and the patients and hospitals depending on them. Families looking to buy a used car to make sure they can get their kids to school on time have had to pay ridiculous prices, in part because of chip shortages in the automotive industry. It's for this exact reason that we voted in a bipartisan manner last Congress to pass the CHIPS Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, which includes unprecedented federal funding to jumpstart our semiconductor industry and reestablish our nation's manufacturing leadership. And when I think about our competitiveness, frankly, our winning, I do think about the major pieces of legislation that we passed last year. My colleague from Florida talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS and Science, of course, but also the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So, Mr. Jasulek, I'm hoping that you can speak about the impact that the $52 billion included in the bipartisan CHIPS and Science Act, as well as the billions of dollars allocated by the infrastructure law to revitalize our roads, our bridges, railways, electric vehicle charging stations, high-speed internet, all that supportive infrastructure will have on U.S. domestic semiconductor manufacturing. And frankly, should we expect more private investment in this critical technology?
Yeah, I think those $52 billion are divided into two big parts. One is 11 to support basic science, research and development that are related to semiconductor manufacturing. I think that helps to overcome the real public good problem of doing that kind of basic research. But there's another $39 billion, the majority of which, $24 billion, provides investment tax credits for private investment. And that means that the decision-making about what's going to be built over what time frame really rests with the private sector. That is, these are credits. They're going to have to put private capital at risk in order to get those credits and expand manufacturing capacity. So I think that the notion that there isn't a market-based, a competitive-based allocation of these funds is a little bit misleading. That said, those two major efforts, both in terms of basic research and in terms of incentivizing investment, should do a lot to increase semiconductor manufacturing capacity. But any business needs an efficient and effective infrastructure to operate, good transportation, good water, good power supply. And I think that the support for that in bipartisan infrastructure will also benefit semiconductor manufacturing, as it will most business in the U.S.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll see if I have enough time to switch gears, because I was so excited to hear so many of my colleagues discuss privacy, because the truth is many of the critical devices that require semiconductors also collect, store, and transmit personal and even sensitive consumer data. My team and I thought about this quite a bit during the markup of the bipartisan and bicameral ADPA last summer. And strong data minimization, data loyalty language allows consumers to escape constant consent pop-ups which are particularly useless in a world where sensors devoid of a screen monitor our vital signs, our sleep patterns, and the location of our pets to create comprehensive profiles of our lives that can be used in a range of predictive analytics. So, Mr. Pugh, maybe for the record, hoping you can speak to the importance of data minimization to this nation's cyber and national security.
I appreciate you can take that for the record. Thank you for the question. And the gentlelady yields back, and I'll recognize the gentlelady from the great state of Tennessee, home of the #1 Florida Gator, Steve Spurrier, Johnson City.
Oh, you would have to mention that.
Of course.
Mr. Chairman.
Of course.
I'll try to forget him.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My question goes, the first one to Mr. Pugh, but let me read a little statement. As a mother and a grandmother, I'm deeply concerned about the ways TikTok is manipulating our nation's children. You know, I've seen reports that detail China's version of TikTok, which offers the friendly version with educational videos and learning tools and time limits set on what the children look at in China. And then you come over here and you see the opium version, which, you know, addicts our children in front of their phone. And that educational tool isn't offered over here like it is in China. What are the current data privacy protections for our children, and how could a comprehensive data security standard help strengthen those protections?
Well, Congresswoman, thank you. Our current standards, simply put, are inadequate. I mean, we have COPA. There were some other attempts to look at children's privacy legislation, but I think the real answer is a comprehensive approach, not the diminished attempts that are specifically directed at children, but really privacy is a concern for all Americans. And I do think that was really a hallmark of ADPPA last Congress was, regardless of age, there was protections there to help you. Specifically with children, there were several phenomenal ones. Everything from additional resources to FTC directed specifically at kids to rules around target advertising for kids. You could tell that kids were definitely a focus in that bill, and I think that should be the case going forward.
Well, and I said this when I was on Homeland. I'm like, if your children are on TikTok, get them off. Get them off. Adults, you're responsible, but children are not. Mrs. Sachs, I think that we both have questions for you with concerning TikTok. And it's, you know, I'm tremendously concerned about TikTok, but I'm sure there's many other Chinese apps that you would suggest that we be watching. And I guess my question is, what other Chinese companies are you concerned about, and what should we be asking? And then the second part is, can you describe how the CCP is encouraging the adoption of emerging technology like artificial intelligence in its defensive capabilities, and how the Beijing's unprecedented emphasis on intellectual property theft in this sector factors into those efforts?
Thank you, and a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
I guess I'll start with the TikTok issue. I think that there are two important issues on the table. One is data security, who has access to what, and the other is the potential to push misinformation online, the recommendation algorithm. My understanding is that there is a national security agreement on the table, and I think and I've published an article which sort of details what exactly that looks like. From a data security standpoint, if Oracle has the data in the cloud, there are multiple third-party auditors and an oversight board that reports to CFIUS, I think that would be pretty much locked down. The question around what kind of information the recommendation system pushes forward is an important one, and that also under this agreement would potentially, and it's called Project Texas, and I've published about it just a week or so ago, would be, again, subject to verification, source code reviewed, essentially vetted by CFIUS. I think it's important that the public understand what that national security agreement would look like, and then have a debate. Is this enough to address those concerns? And to what extent would other social media companies also need to meet those? I think that as a mother, I'm very concerned about what information my young children will be looking at online. And I'm terrified because right now I think it's a free-for-all. When we focus on specific companies, we can lock down that information, but it doesn't solve the issue. We can ban TikTok, force a divestiture. When my boys are teenagers, I hope that there will be a more comprehensive solution, because it is not going to address the way that misinformation is addicting children. And so that is a much bigger issue than any single company.
Well, absolutely, and not to mention, when Director Ray says that is a national security threat, and I know we're not talking about that, but the tracking of users' data, that's a concern. That's a huge concern. And my grandsons are soon to be 6 and 8, so my son and daughter-in-law just better never bring TikTok to the table, okay? And I guess with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back, and I'll recognize my good buddy from the state of Florida, Kat Cameron, for 5 minutes.
Yes, Steve Spurrier, land of Steve Spurrier, go Gators. Thank you, and congratulations to my good friend, Chairman Bilirakis, for hosting this very important hearing today. Thank you to our witnesses. We're coming to the end, so hang in there with us. This topic, our competitive edge against an adversarial nation who uses the existing multilateral system to bend the rules in their favor, the Chinese Communist Party, is one of the most important issues of our time. Indeed, the CCP has very little regard for basic human rights, environmental protections, or the rule of law as they continue on their quest for global dominance. So I believe that the greatest value that we have as a nation is our people, our constitutional republic, and our CQ, our creative quotient. We are innovators. From the space race to the deployment of the internet, the United States has been an international leader on scientific innovation and achievement. Our free market model, paired with our national creative quotient, including private R&D efforts, no doubt drives much of our success as a leader in the world. So the work that we do here today will lead and carry us through the next several decades. Without question, the U.S. and our allies must lead the world in privacy regulations and technological innovation. Otherwise, we risk allowing malign actors like the CCP to create a counter set of rules predicated on debt-trapped economies that will be enticed to leave the rules-based system and adopt a model made to benefit authoritarian countries run by groups like the CCP. So jumping right in, Mr. Pugh, you said in your testimony, and my good friend from Tennessee alluded to this, the protections and privacy laws are wholly inadequate, by and large. How do we balance that patchwork of state laws? How can we do a preemptive federal privacy and data security law that specifically allows for those protections while prohibiting the stifling of entrepreneurs or new market entrants into tech-related industries, quantum computing, social media, AI, et cetera?
Congresswoman, thank you. And I think you really answered the question kind of yourself, because preemption is key. And I think ADPA was a great substantive step in terms of how preemption was solved. And that's exactly the thing. We need one federal standard, not this patchwork that is emerging. Granted, only 5 states will have privacy laws in 2023. We've already seen dozens and dozens introduced this year and last year. So I think the real potential of having even more laws this year and next is going to be there. And it hurts our small and medium-sized companies because they don't largely have the resources to follow all the developments, the constant amendments at a state level, whereas if they have one standard to look to, it may still take resources, but at least it's one standard. So I think that is the key, and making sure preemption is strongly reflected in a federal bill.
I appreciate that. And I'm going to follow up again on my good friend from Tennessee. We were sitting over here talking about TikTok. I'm the millennial in the room. And so this is a generation, grandmother, millennial. But, this is a concern to me, my peers, and the generation coming directly right after me, the Gen Zs. I grew up with social media, MySpace, Facebook, today Meta. These have real-world impacts. Privacy concerns, heck, one social media platform can be directly attributed to a political revolution in nations abroad. So we know that there are real-world impacts that we have to contend with. So obviously TikTok being a huge one. Representative Harshbarger alluded to the fact that in China, on TikTok, children 14 and younger are shown patriotic videos, educational videos, history videos, and they're limited to 40 minutes. In the United States, they have the algorithms set to do shorter videos that are meant to create dopamine hits in your brain. There was a survey done between the United States and China of 14-year-olds asking, what is the most aspirational career you want to have? In the United States, the number one answer was social media influencer. In China, they said they wanted to be an astronaut. If you want to look at the future of our two nations, start here. That is why we need to be very serious about how we contend with TikTok and other apps like TikTok. So my question, and I know I'm running short on time, is how can we protect our kids, our data, while simultaneously respecting free market economics in these applications? The balance is a really tricky one, but we need to have a game plan moving forward on how we contend with this. And if any other witnesses want to answer this, I'm open to hearing your thoughts.
Let's,
In 9 seconds.
Yeah, very brief, and then we're going to take the question for the record. It's a very important question, so I want you to have as much time to answer it. This is what we're facing in this country. Please, briefly.
The short answer, Congressman and Chairman, is passing a national comprehensive data and privacy and security law. We did a report last year with 125 different entities across all ideologies in conjunction with Harvard, and we think that really is the answer of solving some of these national security and privacy concerns.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Now I'll recognize the Vice Chairman. Congratulations, Mr. Vice Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Armstrong. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Sachs, whether it's national security threats from aggression nation states or data protection regimes, it seems as if the trend is towards data localization. You've recently, and even today, mentioned Project Texas, TikTok's proposed mitigation agreement to address U.S. national security concerns as a potential accelerant to data localization requirements. And you were speaking with Congressman Dunn about data free flows with trust. Does our experience with the challenges of the EU-U.S. privacy framework and broader international concerns about U.S. surveillance capabilities make that a realistic proposal in the near term?
Thank you for raising the issue of data localization, because I think this gets at an inherent tension here, right? Governments around the world, the U.S., in Europe, in China, in India, are increasingly concerned with foreign government access to data, as well as private sector access. And so I think what's happening is the response to this is increasing requirements would require data to be stored on local servers and undergo extensive vetting before it's sent abroad. Project Texas, from my understanding of what's been released publicly, would address U.S. government concerns around who has access to the data by storing it in a Oracle cloud with a number of third-party auditors to vet that in terms of the data that leaves. But it also potentially creates a blueprint to accelerate this trend of digital sovereignty, which we've seen around the world beyond the U.S. and China. And so this question of how do you strike a balance between facilitating greater data flows, which are needed for innovation and economic competitiveness, while also addressing legitimate data security questions. This is sort of the key question, and I think it's one that merits much further discussion.
I literally just came up here from asking questions about the Chinese government, a hacking group in Chinese, either with coordination with the Chinese Communist Party or definitely with the permission of the Chinese Communist Party actually going after our COVID relief funds. So, I mean, this is coming from every different place. But we often discuss CCP's collection of U.S. person data by citing the 2015 OPM hack, as well as the hacks on Marriott and Equifax. The follow-up question is usually how the CCP might operationalize that data. I think we understand the ramifications of weaponizing that data against national security officials or Chinese dissidents to blackmail or develop compromat. Can you explain the risks of the CCP aggregating all the data they have obtained and the type of risks it might reveal at the demographic or population levels?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think that creating profiles based on aggregate data is primarily a counterintelligence concern for individuals with national security clearances in the military or access to sensitive information. For your average American, what the impact would probably be more in terms of would that population or individual preference information, could that be used to push information that would make, say, a spear phishing attack more appealing? It might be more likely that someone would click on a link because it appealed to them based on information that was collected. And so I would say I would look at it from that angle. But why I highlighted in my testimony a more sort of far-reaching impact is on economic competitiveness, which is a distinct issue, right? It's on Chinese firms who are able to access diverse international data sets beyond China. What that allows them to do is train AI models that could be more competitive in markets outside of China where they're competing head-to-head with U.S. firms. So I would bucket the risk. You have national security issues. You also have targeted misinformation that could be used from that, as well as economic competitiveness between U.S. and Chinese firms. And it's important to sort of be clear about those distinct buckets of risk.
Mr. Pugh, I'm going to ask you the same question. You got, 45 seconds. The follow-up's always easy, but I think we always operationalize this at the national security, but it's hard to get it down to my 15-year-old daughter who's on TikTok way more than she should be and all of these different issues about the data collection.
I think the key point they recognize, Congressman, is data is not just universal. There's different types of data. So even when it comes to geolocation data, yes, maybe I'm an exception because I serve in the military, but outside of that, I don't want another country knowing where I am in a moment, where I'm going, where my movements are, regardless.
I don't want my own country knowing that.
So I think that is a risk. And then off of that, not only do they collect the data, they're really bad at securing it, evidenced by the breach they had in the Shanghai Police Department last summer. So they're collecting it, and they're not even making it safe. So even other third parties and adversaries are getting it.
And I would just end with, I didn't want to be a social influencer or an astronaut. I wanted to be a fireman, so I became a lawyer and a politician. Thank you. I yield back.
Oh, well, who are you going to blame for that? Folks, well, thank you. We're off to a good start, and I appreciate everything. Seeing there are no further members wishing to be recognized, I want to thank the ranking member. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. And I've got a little housekeeping here. Pursuant to the committee rules, I ask unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record. A letter from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, a report from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation titled Ready to Launch Autonomous Vehicles in the U.S., a presentation by the Alliance for Automotive Innovation titled Policy Roadmap to Advance Automotive Vehicle Innovation, a letter to the Secretary of Transportation, Mr. Buttigieg, regarding the Huawei technologies, the September 2020 China Task Force report, an amendment offered to the Invest in America Act, a letter from the National Federation of the Blind supporting an amendment to the Invest in America Act, a press release from the Jacksonville Transportation Authority regarding their partnership with Beep and Navia to safely transport COVID-19 samples, an article by the Klon Kitchen and Hal Brands entitled Tuya may be the China threat that beats Russia's ransomware attacks, a letter regarding the FCC Secure and Trusted Communication Networks reimbursement program, a letter from the Consumer Brands Association and Information Technology Industry Council, a letter from the Advocates for Highway Safety regarding emerging vehicle technologies and autonomous vehicles, a report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies entitled Empty Bins in a Wartime Environment, the challenge to the U.S. Defense Industrial Base, and finally, a letter from the National Association of Manufacturers. Okay, very good. We got that in. Pursuant to the committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 days, 10 business days, to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witness to respond to the questions promptly. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on February 15th. No other business. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.